if it's so bad that he has to do a mobilization that touches so much more of Russia, um, that he would really have to have a good narrative to accompany that announcement of why this was necessary. Um, I was just reading earlier today about how the Russian airlines are suffering because they don't have enough people to even serve as pilots or flight attendants, and they're canceling flights left and right. Well, no, not a surprise. They have their infrastructure has been disrupted. They're pulling people out of factories to go to the front line. So at some point, even Russia, I mean, has a limit on their manpower.
And how will you, I suppose, again, this does depend on what Ukraine's objective is, but how will Ukraine judge the success of this operation? If they're able to hold this territory for a month, is that a success? If they lost the territory they'd captured tomorrow, is it still a success because of the message it sends to the Kremlin?
Well, the first thing you said is exactly right. We can't judge if it's a success if we don't know what they were trying to accomplish. But for me, from my perspective, if it changes the narrative, all these doomers out there that are saying, "Oh my God, there's no way Ukraine can win. Russia, it's inevitable that Russia's going to win," and the doomers who are constantly finding fault with everything that Ukraine does, if this shuts them up, that will be a success. The fact that Russia has not retaliated in some sort of escalatory way because they can't, I think also should help give our leaders confidence that the we should be supporting Ukraine with everything that they need. I mean, if it's true, and I think it is, if it's true that tanks provided by Germany and UK and other armored vehicles are actually involved in this operation. Obviously, these are Ukrainian armored vehicles, but there were people who were wetting themselves at the idea that a German Leopard or a British Challenger might be cause for escalation. I mean, it's ridiculous thinking, but that's how some people were thinking about this. Hopefully, this will change that narrative. And then finally, um, the idea that now that everybody has drones, it's impossible to conceal anything. It's impossible to move ground forces. That's just not true. I mean, from the history of warfare, over 3,000 years, I think Michael Clark told somebody yesterday, hey, read a book. There's 3,000 years of military history out there. Um, every time somebody gets a capability, the other side gets a new capability to counter it. I mean, that's the way it works. And so it's not a surprise that Ukraine may have figured out a way to counter Russia's drone advantage.
Do you think it's feasible we may see further incursions by Ukraine along different stretches of the border?
Well, I think we have been underestimating Ukraine from the very beginning. It would not surprise me if they were able to do this again. But of course, that'll be driven by opportunity. It'll be driven by how they judge the effectiveness of the current operation. You know, if you think back to what their grandfathers were doing during the Second World War on the Eastern Front, the Soviets and the German Wehrmacht, both sides on these huge fronts, it was not uncommon that somebody would launch a successful attack that would penetrate the so-called line, and the best units were not bothered by this. In fact, they would see these as opportunity. So I think it'll be interesting to watch and see, do the Russians, are they capable of mustering forces that could see opportunity here and um, destroy this penetration, which is what their grandfathers would have done? Or do the Ukrainians see opportunity to do this again in another place? Uh, the whole point being to not just recapture territory, but also to change the momentum, to get the Russians on the back foot.
This is, of course, the largest cross border raid on Russia since the Second World War. How humiliating is it for Vladimir Putin?
Well, I imagine he is throwing coffee cups around his office right now, aimed at aimed at people that keep bringing him bad news. I would imagine this is very difficult. Of course, what I've never been able to truly discern is how do the Russian people see all this? I mean, they how they get information is pretty controlled. Um, but if you've got what appears to be over 100,000 Russian civilians from the Kursk area are on the move now, you know, as they begin to talk about what's happening, you know, that inevitably will get to the population in Moscow, either because of relatives or however it gets there. and so we'll see what sort of impact that has. I think for me, one of the most important uh, effects of this is Ukraine is now attacking airfields that are deeper inside Russia. So, in other words, they've moved their line much further forward, where even if they're using weapons of their own, they're able to attack airfields from which the Russians were launching attacks against Ukrainian cities. I think yesterday or the day before was supposedly the largest drone swarm of drones on any airfields of the war. That is significant. That will not only degrade Russian capability, but it also will force them to have to start moving further and further away, uh, complicating their own efforts to attack Ukrainian cities.
And again, that strengthens the argument that Ukraine should be allowed to use long range Western supplied missiles inside Russian territory. Do you think it's feasible that maybe the strategy of President Biden and other Western leaders is that now is not the moment to announce that they are giving the green light for such actions? That in the immediate wake of the incursion, it would be seen as too much of an escalation against Russia. But in a few weeks, once the dust has settled, they may move on this because they've seen what's happened with this incursion.
Well, James, you and I have talked about this several times, how frustrating it is that my government and your government have not and the German government have not committed to doing everything required to help Ukraine actually win. I mean, a lot has been provided to keep them in the fight, but we haven't committed to helping Ukraine win, to knock Russia back to the 1991 borders. If we would do that, then I think there would be none of these nonsensical policies about restricting, well, you can't do this, or you can only do a little of this, et cetera, et cetera. I think hopefully, hopefully this will change, of course, in the United States now with President Biden having stepped aside, not running for reelection. I don't know the impact that will have uh, on his thinking. I don't get the sense that he's ready to loosen up now. Um, so I can't predict how this is going to go, but I wish they would commit to helping Ukraine win. That would improve Europe's security environment for decades if Russia were actually defeated.
Do you think we may see a fresh wave of Russian mobilization off the back of this? I mean, if Putin is reluctant to divert too many troops from the front line in the east of Ukraine, he's not left with that many other options. Maybe he has to look again at mobilization.
All right, another great question. You really should consider journalism as a profession. Um, the um, it seems to me that the Kremlin has been holding off this kind of mobilization that you described because of the message that would send to the public. And I think the Kremlin is very, very sensitive to what the public thinks and does and how they might react, and how his oligarchs, so people who actually keep him in power, how they would react to that. And so if it's so bad that he has to do a mobilization that touches so much more of Russia, um, that he would really have a good narrative to accompany that announcement of why this was necessary. Um, I was just reading earlier today about how the Russian airlines are suffering because they don't have enough people to even serve as pilots or flight attendants, and they're canceling flights left and right. Well, no, not a surprise. They have their infrastructure has been disrupted. They're pulling people out of factories to go to the front line. So at some point, even Russia, I mean, has a limit on their manpower.